Suppose that a girl who has spent her entire life adhering to strict moral principles and protecting her innocence is suddenly faced with the opportunity to change everything she thought was important and right. Priscilla is a typical good girl living in a small town and attending college. She is often surrounded by friends and acquaintances, but her relationships with guys have always remained on the level of just socializing. She wasn't looking for a crush and led a fairly quiet and measured life, preferring to focus on her studies and future. However, everything changes when she meets Brad, an experienced and confident guy who becomes an object of strong attraction for her. His charm, confidence, and candor begin to uncover her hidden desires and fears. When her friend Natalie inspires her to try to experience her first personal feelings, Priscilla is faced with a dilemma: continue to follow the principles she has always held, or let her emotions and desires take over, whatever that means. Over the course of the story, Priscilla will be forced not only to live through her doubts, but also to face the consequences of what she decides to change in her life. Will she be willing to accept the consequences of her actions and learn new things? Or will her inner conflict lead to serious disappointment and loss of trust in herself and others? Questions about love, friendship, and self-acceptance will be the foundation of her journey that may change her life forever. Priscilla White is a girl who grew up in a strict, moralistic environment where emphasis was always placed on education, decency, and adherence to traditional values. She is an example of a good girl who strives to make her life right without unnecessary emotions and spontaneous decisions. Her worldview is limited by the boundaries set by her family and society, which leads to internal conflict as she redefines her feelings and perceptions of herself. Priscilla is not looking for adventure, nor is she thinking about experiencing anything new or alive. She's focused on her studies and preparing for the future, avoiding any situation that might jeopardize her reputation or her status as an untouchable girl. But her encounter with Brad, a guy who is the complete opposite of her ordinary life, becomes a turning point. His confidence, free-spiritedness, and way of speaking begin to break down her barriers, making her wonder if it's possible to be both good and real while following her desires. Priscilla's motivation undergoes a dramatic change as she realizes her own desires and begins to find a way to be true to herself. Her inner journey is to realize how the alignment of her principles and personal desires can be a source of strength rather than weakness. The desire to be accepted, the desire to know what it means to be alive, and the quest to understand what she really wants out of her life all collide with her initial beliefs. But can she overcome her fears? Or will it eventually lead her to the self-discovery she has avoided for so long? The environment plays a key role in creating the context in which Priscilla's story unfolds. Most of the events take place at the college where she attends, and this environment is presented as a mixture of strict academic requirements and steadily rising social tensions. Here, Priscilla encounters a world where she must balance her responsibilities with her desire to be herself. Campus walls, libraries, and lecture halls are symbols of her attempts to follow the rules, while other spaces, parties, campus cafes, and nightclubs become places where her inner contradictions begin to reveal themselves. Her friend Natalie Naz Stevens serves as a contrast to Priscilla. Naz is a bold, free-spirited, often ironic girl who is not afraid to express her feelings and desires. She is the kind of person who is always ready to break down barriers, determined to make contact with the opposite sex, and often in search of fun and adventure. It's her attitude to life that makes Priscilla wonder: is it possible to be serious and liberated at the same time? Naz is her opposite, but also her mirror, in which Priscilla sees what she could be if she were free of all her complexes. Brad himself, the young man Priscilla falls in love with, is a guy with a dark, careless charm. He's bright, charismatic, and free-spirited, but his image is not without its flaws. He presents a seductive challenge to Priscilla, drawing her in with his independence and frank manner. But his easygoing nature and ambiguous attitude toward love make Priscilla feel insecure and uneasy, which at one point only intensifies her inner struggle. The conflict in Priscilla's life begins when her personal and emotional experiences do not match the expectations of her environment and her own ambitions. Amidst her insecurities and her desire to stay true to her principles, Priscilla finds that the world she lives in dictates its own rules, often in opposition to her moral compass. The problems begin when she tries to sort out her feelings for Brad, a guy who doesn't share her views on relationships. He is what she considers to be the ideal, but his attitude towards her turns out to be far from what she expects. In an attempt to please him and be the center of his attention, Priscilla finds herself at a crossroads: become part of his world or stay true to herself. Her relationship with Naz becomes increasingly complicated. Naz, as free and confident as she acts, is actually hiding her own insecurities and desires, which begin to manifest themselves in her relationship with Priscilla. At one point, she begins to manipulate Priscilla by turning her against Chuck, motivating her by saying that she deserves better. Naz sees Priscilla as her projection, a girl who can be as free and independent as herself. But these manipulations also begin to erode their friendship, as Priscilla feels that she cannot trust Naz. Meanwhile, Priscilla finds the strength to reconsider her attitude toward her own values. The problems with Brad and Naz begin to shift her focus from external factors, relationships and the opinions of others, to internal harmony. A sense begins to emerge that her actions must come from an inner conviction rather than external pressures. But the solution she arrives at is not so simple. She begins to realize that love and relationships are not only feelings and passion, but also hard work and sincerity. Priscilla's inner conflict is expressed in her attempts to free herself from external pressures and overcome her insecurities. She realizes that she cannot continue to play other people's roles and follow other people's expectations if she wants to be herself. It is a journey of self-discovery that eventually leads to a moment of maturity and the realization that in order to be happy, one must not follow someone else, but follow one's own path. The climax in Priscilla's life comes when she is faced with the ultimate choice between continuing to follow other people's expectations or recognizing her own desires and goals. This moment comes when her relationship with Brad reaches a critical point. He once again shows his true nature by not living up to her expectations and ideals. Priscilla finally realizes that her attachment to him is not based on real love, but on her desire for idealized relationships and recognition. At this point, she decides to cut ties with him and no longer sacrifice herself for other people's desires. This decision becomes a turning point for her. She is no longer trying to be someone to meet someone else's standards. She decides that it is more important to be herself rather than conform to other people's expectations. It also forces her to reevaluate her relationship with Naz, who has recently begun to influence her more and more, pushing her to make decisions she would never have made in her right mind. Priscilla realizes that her real problem isn't men or friendships, but her own need for recognition and attention, and unless she changes that need, she will never find harmony in a relationship. The climax reaches its climax when Priscilla decides not to follow false desires, but to find a balance between herself and the world around her. She realizes that what is more important is not the recognition and approval of others, but her own peace of mind and self-confidence. This decision helps her choose her path and give up the pressure to be someone she wasn't. In this moment, she gains the strength to recognize her feelings and also learns to say no. When something or someone steps outside of her personal boundaries, a turning point occurs in her relationship with Naz when Priscilla finally puts a stop to their friendship, realizing that Naz has been manipulating her for her own ends. This breaks the toxic bond that has stifled her growth and development. Along the way, Priscilla learns not to depend on other people's judgment and decides to live her life wholeheartedly and freely. After Priscilla decides to finally change her life and rid herself of her toxic relationship with Brad and Naz, her inner conflict begins to resolve. It doesn't happen instantly, and she faces the consequences of her previous decisions. Breaking up with Brad gives her a sense of release, but also makes her feel lonely. She realizes that her desire for love and acceptance from others is not the basis for her happiness. However, now, instead of seeking external approval, she decides to focus on herself. Her decision to get out of this destructive relationship gives her the opportunity to reclaim her own boundaries and principles. Priscilla no longer feels that her life depends on other people or their evaluations. She finds the strength to move forward despite her fears and doubts. Rethinking her values and striving to be honest with herself become the key to a new phase for her. She starts working on herself, finds new hobbies, and meets new people who, unlike Brad and Naz, support her unconditionally. But the most important change happens within her. Priscilla begins to realize that her life is not just a quest for approval from men or friends, but a journey toward inner harmony and independence. She realizes that her worth is not determined by the opinions of others. At the same time, she realizes that her relationship with Naz was not healthy, and that she should no longer allow anyone to manipulate her decisions. As Priscilla finds her way, she also frees herself from old fears and complexes associated with her image and inner experiences. Her transformation becomes not only internal but also external. She's not trying to please everyone anymore. She's not trying to be someone she's not. Instead, she decides to live her life on her own terms, with the full realization that she deserves happiness and respect just the way she is. What would you do if you were Priscilla? If you had to choose between following your desires and trying to please others, which would you choose? Is it easy to find a balance between self-respect and relationships with others? Do you think it is possible to maintain your identity if you are constantly trying to conform to other people's expectations? When Priscilla decides to end a toxic relationship, she faces a challenge that many of us may have faced: the willingness to let go of what is harmful for the sake of being true to ourselves. Would it have been easy for you to make that choice? How would you react to the same circumstances? At what point do you realize the importance of putting yourself first? And what is more important, freedom from other people's expectations or harmonious relationships with others? What is the true value for you in a relationship? Independence or mutual dependence?